Kuznetsov is out with the Carolina Hurricanes, which suddenly means Marty Necas and Nikolaj Ehlers might finally be in play. Will the Canes go with their own man, or will the Jets be trading Ehlers to Carolina? Let's talk about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. But most of all, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we're kicking it off with obviously some conversations about a big development that doesn't actually directly connect to the Jets yet, but perhaps will in the near future, as Yevgeny Kuznetsov has had his contract, basically terminated. He was, unconditionally waived, and so this now opens the door for Carolina to do a couple of different things. The big thing that they could do is that they could bring back one of their star young players, Marty Necas, and that would obviously be likely a pretty hefty extension. I think you're talking about a big 6 or 7 year deal, lots of money, and for Carolina, I sort of wonder what their thinking is, right? Because Necas is a great finisher, very skilled. It's obvious that he's a good player, but in terms of like his primary scoring rates and some of the underlying numbers in his performances, there are some flags that maybe he's not doing as much of his own lifting, which isn't always a problem when you're signing top-end offensive talents, especially if they're good finishers, right? You have plenty of need for guys who can punch goals in. But when you're looking at how the Canes are built, and really a lot of their approach to how they've constructed their team, he kind of goes a little bit against the grain. This is a very forward-thinking front office, a very smart team, and obviously for Carolina, Necas perhaps doesn't have the usual profile of a player that they would usually extend long-term. I want to talk a little bit about why that might mean the Jets have an opportunity here in just a moment. But before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because as playoffs wind down and the sports stop sportsing like we love them to, obviously you're looking for some fun, and the summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, obviously the whole Necas thing has sort of been a bit of a black cloud hanging over Carolina's offseason. The Canes made their biggest move, of course, by bringing back their coaching staff. But when it comes to the Necas question, I do think it's a little bit challenging, right? Tulsky is a very smart person. He uses a good mixture of holistic analysis with a lot of really informed database decisions and data pieces. And so when he's going through the numbers and crunching them for what Necas's value is, what his market value likely is, and he's looking at all of this, I kind of wonder if he's not really hot to trot to re-sign Necas long-term. Now, obviously, sending Kuznetsov to Russia essentially opens the door for him to make a decision either way. It doesn't have to be an extension. It could be a trade. Maybe they do some sort of a bridge or something. Not that I think they would. I would think it'd be a long-term deal, and I think Necas is probably looking to get locked up at this point, right? I don't think he wants to do a short-term thing that gets him to free agency, unless he plays it differently. But my feeling is if the Canes just cleared out this cap space, it's because they're intending to sign a fairly large contract with somebody. Now, where I kind of wonder about all of this is if the Jets are trying to perhaps sneak in on this deal. There's been lots of talk about them wanting to perhaps make a deal with the Canes on Ehlers, or at least Carolina has expressed a lot of that interest. I think conversations have been ongoing for a while. And when you think about the kinds of players the Canes really value, Ehlers really ticks off a lot of the boxes. He's fast, he's skilled, he's an excellent creator, and I think in a lot of ways he does a huge job in transition, which is kind of, a unique skill set at this level that I think is fairly underrated. And with Ehlers, he's genuinely one of the best at it. I don't know if he necessarily solves a specific need for Carolina. I do think he'll have probably a good 25 to 30 goal season, maybe 30 or 40 points if he stays healthy and he gets like a top 6 billing with them. But obviously, where I sort of wonder from Carolina's perspective is, Necas is like 24, 25. He has some positional versatility, and, he is younger and rights control. Do you give that up in exchange for a player that is probably overall much better, but perhaps has a shortened time span of his ability to play at this level and does come with a fair few health risks? I love Ehlers, but it's no secret that he does get injured a fair bit, and everyone does get hurt at some point. I mean, there's not many players who have had really extended Ironman streaks, but I think Ehlers probably gets hurt a little more than some of his peers, right? He hasn't had too many seasons where he's playing loads and loads of games. So for me, I think it's a really interesting question. Now, I guess from our perspective, right, do we want Necas? I'm kind of mixed on it. Like I said, his primary scoring rates and stuff have been a little bit mixed. I think he has the ability to bring some skill sets that the Jets definitely lack. And in terms of skating, there's no question that Necas is fast and very good on his edges. He's got great lateral skating. I think he's very mobile, and he does play pretty well as a winger. But there's a part of me that also wonders if you start to run into a Kyle Connor situation where you can only play him with a few different kinds of players, and it really takes away from his overall value in your top 6. I don't know what the Jets would want with him other than to try him at second line center. I know people will say, well, he's a better winger, but we also haven't really seen Rod force the issue of Necas down the middle. The Canes have the luxury of having guys like Aho and Teravainen who can both man the middle. And so, they have less need to try and force this move, whereas the Jets definitely are looking for a 2C, whether it's Perfetti, Nemesnikov. I guess you could talk about Lambert if it really gets desperate, but I think the Jets would probably prefer somebody with real NHL experience that can grow into this role. We all know Lowry will probably get tons of 5v5 minutes anyways, but I guess from Winnipeg's perspective, I memean, if you're talking about returns, Necas is probably the best that you get, and I think that's not really saying anything negatively, but I don't know. There are some stats profile red flags for me, and I would really hope to be wrong about it because I think Necas does have room for growth. I think he's got a lot of skill, and there's no question that he would pack some considerable punch, both at even strength and on the power play for the Jets. But you do wonder, do you run into those sort of empty calorie point sort of situations? Is it him feeding off of the excellence of his teammates consistently, or is he helping to create some of those own opportunities? Stylistically, I've watched some of his footage, and he definitely has the ability to create his own space, and he's a very opportunistic poacher. I think he's smart like that, and I think it's something that's similar to how Velarde, loves to attack the crease and slot. But Velarde is also one of those guys who's like a really big volume shooter and with the right line combination, an absolute unholy menace on the wing. With Necas, I kind of wonder if he has that same potential. But again, if he's asking for like 7 or 8 million for like 6 or 7 years, it's not a great gamble. I would have some reservations. I would have to really think about it. And, even with the cap ceiling going up, I just... part of me feels like it could end badly for Winnipeg if they pursue this deal. In the $6 million or $6.5 million range, I don't feel as bad about it. But at that point, the Canes might as well just bring Necas back if that's their view. If he's willing to come down to that price range, then I wouldn't be shocked if they just decide to retain him and hope that he improves naturally. So, I mean, it's a weird situation, right? Obviously, you're talking about two players that have two very different styles and are also at two very different stages of their careers. And while I personally think Ehlers is the more impactful player, one of them's considerably younger and has rights control. So that definitely plays a big part of it. But we'll have to see what Carolina does. If they're doing this Kuznetsov thing, it probably means that they've got something in the pipes that is about to come out, whether it's a trade or a big signing of a sort. So we'll see. Let's hope that, whatever happens with Ehlers, it benefits the Jets. He'll always be one of my favorite players, regardless of who he's playing for. And it is a little bit of a shame that his best years weren't always made or weren't always taken advantage of with the squad. But no use crying over spilled milk. At this point, it is time to move on to the future. Now, talking about the future, obviously there's a prospect that we haven't really spent a lot of time discussing, in part because, well, he's playing overseas, and with the KHL rules officially changing recently, maybe it's time to consider Demitri Rashevsky coming over to the U.S. Well, not to the U.S., but to North America. Could be a conversation we're ready to have. We'll talk about him and what he's been doing overseas in just a little bit. But before we go any further, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. I love sports, and obviously I love them so much that I wish they didn't end, especially, the absence of hockey right now is kind of sucking. It's been tough not to have anything super exciting with the Winnipeg Jets to watch, but, it is what it is. We did get a pretty good Stanley Cup final. We got to see Paul Maurice get his trophy, but, the sports are still not sportsing like I want them to. FanDuel totally gets it, and that's why they want to help me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up any bets that I'm interested in when I'm in the mood. And the summer, FanDuel is opening up some great bonuses for all customers. A bonus that's either daily, a great option, right? If you're looking for something that's daily, it's for everyone, and it's all summer long. If you're interested, head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about some conversations around Winnipeg's offseason, and obviously the Jets are, they're in a bit of a holding pattern, but I think Winnipeg, for the most part, is looking to kind of round out some of their depth positions and maybe create some camp competition. And one of the players that I think is very interesting to me and somebody that I kind of wonder about a bit, it's Demitri Rashevsky. Rashevsky obviously is overseas right now, and I think for me, I'm very curious to know what happens with him. Rashevsky has been putting up some pretty strong numbers in the KHL. And, I get it. The KHL obviously isn't as elite as North American hockey is. There definitely has been, since, the war in Ukraine, a decline in the overall quality of the league. And I think that's actually been something that even precedes the recent conflict. There's definitely been some shifts and changes. And I sort of wonder if it was just inevitable with how much talent continues to be amassed in North America these days. But with Rashevsky, I mean, he's been putting up 35 to 40-ish point seasons, around 0.64 points per game. I'm not quite sure what that translates to in the NHL. Last I recall, I think the K is around half NHL points, something like that. Those comparative models are certainly not one-to-one, right? It's a pretty rough approximation. I could be misremembering, but I think if you probably looked at that as around 20 to 25 points in the NHL, that's bottom six territory, maybe a third liner, especially if you're looking at maybe 10 goals, 15 assists or something like that. I think that's not really crazy to consider. Rashevsky has kind of been putting up some pretty decent goal scoring over the past couple of seasons. He's had 24 this past year. Prior to that, and in the year before, 19 goals apiece, which is pretty nice. And he's 23. He's still pretty young. He's basically in his prime at this point, and he plays a position that the Jets could honestly use an upgrade on. He's a right winger. And I think for Winnipeg, right, you're sort of wondering if his relentless offensive forechecking and his speed and skill is something that you want to perhaps build upon, right? You look at how the Jets have been drafting recently, and it seems like they want players with lots of motors, I guess humming like a Harley Davidson the whole game. They want guys who are willing to crash the net and also have some offensive flair, right? You look at Kevin He, you look at Nikita Chibrikov. These players are sort of coming into this very direct but effective approach that I think the Jets are looking for. Strong releases, maybe, not the most complicated approach, but one that continues to deliver scoring chances and results. And Rashevsky could be an interesting one if he's able to come over. I think this is more a question of whether he wants to. And considering that he's probably playing a pretty prime role in Russia right now, I don't know if he has a lot of incentive to leave yet. But for me, right, if I'm thinking about the chances for him to actually make this lineup, especially with McGroarty kind of taking a backseat and the Jets perhaps needing to free up some salary if they make a couple of trades, I'm not against the idea of really trying to bring him over. And it sounds like Cheveldayoff has thought about this because he was asked during the draft and I think camp about the whole situation. And he didn't say a ton, don't get me wrong. He wasn't tipping his hand exactly, but he did say that nothing is out of the question, more or less, and that there appears to be some sort of attempt for the Jets to try to lure him over. So that I find interesting. I do suspect that there's some real potential here for Rashevsky to join Winnipeg. And I think coming out of camp, I wouldn't be shocked if he actually does make a pretty compelling case to join Winnipeg's roster. I think he's got a fair bit of pro experience. He's been playing, look, the KHL may not be the highest level of hockey, but it is a pretty darn good league compared to many of the other ones internationally. It's still a strong league. It's still a pretty competitive one. And, I don't think it would be that crazy for him to try to adapt to North American ice. I think if he does join Winnipeg, I would expect him to kind of be fighting for maybe like an Appleton sort of spot or on the fourth line. I think, I can't really see him coming into Winnipeg and having like a really big offensive production level. I sort of look at his numbers in the KHL and maybe they're a little bit deceptive, but I continue to think that he is kind of in that mid-tier of like a middle six to bottom six player, which is fine. Winnipeg getting more types like that who can also, in a pinch, maybe slide up if things get really desperate. I don't mind that. I think that's great. And it's nice if you can develop those players internally. Especially interesting if you have Shibrikov, who maybe would make his countrymen feel at home. So I think that there's, some real merit to trying to have this conversation. I think you don't want him to keep playing overseas for much longer. The more time that he spends overseas, it's just less time for him to get acclimated to the North American game, to getting used to the Winnipeg way of life. And he starts to develop habits that may be a little bit hard to undo if he continues to stay there. I think the Jets certainly have some incentive to try and see if he's willing to come over and fight for a spot out of camp. I think Winnipeg really could use an offensive boost in its bottom six. As it is, like right now, it's strong, and I think it did a really good job of eating tough minutes this past year. But you have to find ways to be that 5 to 10% better. I keep coming back to Arniel talking about that, and I think it is very true, especially for the Jets, because the top end of our roster really doesn't have insane levels of pop. We're not talking about a McKinnon or a McDavid or a Matthews or some of these guys. You have a really strong top nine, but it's not one that scores loads of goals. Winnipeg last year was really defined by an amazingly strong defensive structure that occasionally was undone with some of the roster and personnel decisions, but overall, you had one of the best defensive team structures backed by the best goaltending in the league. So for me, I just think that there's a real chance to try and improve upon what you've already built foundationally. And with Arniel interested in playing the kids more, I mean, Rashevsky doesn't really fit in that particular category for me. He is, at this point, a relatively seasoned pro veteran. He's been playing pro hockey at some level for like the past like 6 or 7 years. So, I think it's time for him to really make that jump. And given that he's spent like the last 4 or 5 years in the KHL, I do wonder if he's ready to make that transition. Maybe he's really comfortable playing in Moscow, but for me, again, I think that Winnipeg has some legit openings. I think he would have a really good shot at actually making a spot out of camp. And I think anything that can push the kids to go even further and work harder and get him, get better faster, it's all positive for me. Again, it can be a little bit of a challenge to recruit players to Winnipeg as it is, but this is the route that he's got to get into the NHL, and I think Winnipeg is probably a pretty decent landing spot, especially if you're thinking about a team that is potentially playoff competitive and that wants to make the most of its ELCs. So some thoughts there. I'm just hoping that he's willing to come over. I think the Jets are probably putting out those feelers and getting a sense of what his thought process is. He's put up some pretty nice numbers overseas, and I think he would translate reasonably well at the NHL level. Now, Rashevsky probably fits also in sort of our next and closing topic, perhaps underrated storylines and things to think about for the upcoming season. A couple of players I've sort of circled for this particular discussion, and we'll talk about those and sort of what is maybe flying a little bit under the radar for Winnipeg in just a little bit. But before we close out, I just wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed does great matching. It also offers you tons of different easy tools to help you avoid busy work because they do scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with quality candidates faster. And again, they don't just help you hire faster, they offer you top-end quality candidates who actually match your job requirements. I've used Indeed when I was looking for work. I can personally attest to how convenient it was. Very easy to fill out, and upload my resume, get that information in there. And it actually recommends jobs that legitimately fit your salary requirements, your job experience, all that stuff. And there's over 3.5 million businesses worldwide that already use Indeed to hire, so why not join them? Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions do apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Jets. We're just closing out with some final thoughts ahead of what's been perhaps, not the most crazy offseason, but for Winnipeg, I think, there's not been a ton of excitement so far, probably a little bit of disappointment in some respects, but, it is what it is, part of the whole game. You're not going to have everything go right for you 100% of the time, but for the Jets, obviously, there's been a big focus on the future. And I think that's where Winnipeg is really hoping that a lot of their depth prospects start to make a pro level jump. There's a couple of guys that I've kind of penciled in here as some potential names that I'm kind of thinking about. One guy that I'm sort of keeping an eye out for is Connor Levis. Obviously Levis, he's been spending quite a bit of time with, a couple of different WHL teams. He's had a couple of Moose games. And I think he's one guy who, his numbers don't really jump off the page at the junior level, but I do think that he's got some offensive talent and skill. And I'm curious to know how that would translate with Manitoba over the course of a full season. He's not, a young prospect necessarily, at 19 compared to a lot of the other major junior kids and stuff. He is kind of getting closer and closer to that age where he's going to start physically dominating players and stuff. But I do think that, in sort of the training camp games that we saw last year, I thought he made some really mature, simple plays. It wasn't anything crazy. I don't think that there was high-end elite talent that immediately screamed, middle six to top six potential. But in terms of a guy who looked really comfortable, perhaps playing in a fourth line role, maybe as your eventual successor to Nemesnikov or something of that ilk, he might be able to do the job really well. Again, I don't think that his upside is going to be something that really shines at the pro level, but I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. Obviously, he's going to carve his own path, and the only thing that you could hope for is that he continues to do pretty well. So, I don't know that he's got like a crazy ceiling, but again, if you're looking for a player to kind of keep an eye out for, and maybe somebody who you hope grows at the professional level, it'll be interesting, right? Again, his scoring rate's kind of low for junior, but again, maybe he starts to figure it out at the AHL level in the near future. Another guy that I'm sort of curious about is Danny Zilkin. Danny kind of had his whole season last year really sidelined. He only played about half of the year, and then he had a shoulder injury that kept him out for a while. Notched a handful of points, about like around a fourth of a point per game. And Zilkin, I don't think that he's got like a really crazy ceiling, but if you're looking for a really hardworking player who has, again, sort of a relentless motor, pretty strong skating, and can be a real pest in the corners. Zilkin, I think, is one of those guys who likely, slots in as your future fourth line centery type. Again, sort of in the vein of where I sort of have Levis, although I think Zilkin might have an even more pro-ready approach already. He's a player that I'm very intrigued by for Winnipeg's depth situation. And if he takes a really big step forward this coming year, I'd be curious to know what his performance really looks like. He's sort of one of those players that I don't think has jumped off the page, but in terms of guys that I think have some real surprising pop to their game, Zilkin could be somebody that's really exciting for the future. And he's only 20, right? He's still very young. He's had quite a few years with Guelph, and I think at this point you're hoping that he just has a healthy season for the Moose. He's able to stick around, and to see him maybe take more of an offensive role this year, because obviously, 7 points, 44 games in your first pro season, not a lot. I think you want to see him start to really grow his performance, but it is kind of hard to really judge that. I mean, it's his first pro year, and I think increasingly over the past couple of years, we've seen it become increasingly harder for young prospects to make that pro jump. It is a brutal skill gap these days, and it's not getting easier. So, interesting player. Very curious to know what he seems like with the Moose this coming season. The last guy that I'm kind of also keeping an eye on, and I don't quite know what his performance level is like as of right now. He's not really doing a ton in the SHL, but Fabian Wagner is kind of out there, and somebody that I think every time he comes into like the international tournaments, he's really explosive. But then you look at his actual performance for his pro teams, and it's been there. I don't think that the 6 points in 41 games for Lonkelping is like something that's going to get people excited, but he is very young. He's 20 again, and I think he's got some higher level skill at times. I think he's a smart player, and I think there's a question of, given the time and development, can he translate that to the North American game? I don't know if he has like crazy upside. I think his probably tops out at around third liner, which if that's what you get out of a very late round pick, I mean, you are just laughing to the bank. Any guy out of like the fourth round or beyond that somehow becomes an NHLer, it's just crazy value, right? It's basically found money. And I think for the Jets, when you're dealing with a situation where you maybe don't have the most elite talent that a lot of the top contenders do, you've got to build out and round out your squad in other ways. And so I think the general theme that you're seeing with some of these players is, sure, first pro season or so has maybe been a bit of a rough ride for the young kids. But what you're hoping for is that they take a big leap forward this upcoming season, and maybe in 2-ish years, you start to think about them really making an impact at the NHL level. Maybe even sooner if things really kick off this year. For a lot of kids, there's a real growing up period, making the pros, or even just moving into North American hockey. So let's keep an eye on that. We're rooting for these kids to really succeed, because a lot of these guys are sort of the depth ELCs that you really need to round out the middle and bottom portions of your roster. And it'd be nice if the Jets actually, not only draft well, but also start to develop and turn those prospects into full-time NHLers. So fun stuff ahead for the Jets, but of course, a lot of these guys are still a bit of a ways off. So we will just have to see. But let me know which of these prospects or other guys that you're really circling on your must-follow list for the upcoming seasons. Drop your names and thoughts below, or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with more Jets offseason coverage and hopefully at some point, some kind of trade news. But like I said, for tonight's episode, that's all the time that we have. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.